Welcome to this exploration of one of the Appalachian Mountains' most eerie tales. There is a story that defies logical explanation in the Kentucky highlands, where mist dances among the pines and silence holds ancient secrets. As we explore this sinister story that will always be associated with those forgotten mountains, let us know where you are watching. This video was made purely for amusement and is a work of fiction. Any similarity to real people living or deceased is entirely coincidental. Kentucky has consistently been a contradictory place. Its mountains are incredibly remote and breathtakingly beautiful. Entire communities cut off from the outside world by perilous paths and miles of dense forest. These areas existed almost outside of time at the start of the 20th century, with news arriving weeks later and the law having limited authority over isolated valleys. It was a place where nature triumphed over human attempts to subdue it, where tales were born and died without witnesses. Known as Abigail Kincaid in the neighborhood as a strong-willed woman with odd habits. She lived alone in a dilapidated wooden home that was inherited from her family and straddled the boundary between civilization and the unknown. Few people came to her door without a specific reason, and her closest neighbors lived more than 3 kilometers away. Even the most courageous people felt uneasy about the intensity with which she gazed at them. There was a history to the Kincaid estate, constructed decades ago by people looking to make their fortune in the land had never been kind to its owners, mountains. Animals mysteriously became ill, crops failed for no apparent reason, and there was a general sense of heaviness, as if the air were denser there. Some blamed the poor soil quality for these occurrences. Others muttered less logical justifications, folktales that rumored in the local taverns. Abigail didn't have many social connections. She only went to the city when it was absolutely necessary, and it was always in the late afternoon when the streets started to vacant. Before total darkness descended, she returned to her mountain after purchasing necessities and chatting briefly with the merchants. Rumors filled the void left by the lack of specific information, but no one knew exactly how she spent her days on that remote property. Something changed in 1920. Strange occurrences were reported by travelers who were passing by the road close to the property. At night, lights move among the trees. There were noises that seemed to be unrelated to any known animal, an oppressive sensation that caused the horses to refuse to continue. At first, these reports were written off as the usual superstition of people passing through remote areas, but the regularity of the sightings started to garner attention. According to the local grocery store owner, Abigail's shopping habits have changed. She used to only purchase necessities for one person, but lately she has begun purchasing more food. She gave evasive answers to subtle questions, shifting the topic or just walking away before completing the dialogue. Her always reticent demeanor had grown even more mysterious. A local hunter with experience made the decision to look into it himself. I didn't believe in curses or ghost stories, and I knew those mountains like few others. One autumn afternoon, when golden leaves covered the ground like a deceptively inviting carpet, he walked up to the Kincaid property. He watched from a distance, concealed among the oak trees, but he never made it to the house. He was deeply troubled by what he saw, but he was never able to put it into words. Obviously, all he said was that something was seriously wrong there, something that his decades of mountain experience had failed to explain. There were more reports in the weeks that followed. A mailman who delivered mail to neighboring farms claimed to have seen multiple people moving inside the cads and to have seen silhouettes at the window. Everyone knew Abigail lived alone, but this would be typical in any other home. When questioned covertly about potential guests, she angrily denied it, her eyes shining with a mixture of rage and something more elusive, maybe fear. In the mountains, the air became heavier and heavier. Longer routes were preferred over the road that passed close to the King property, even by those who did not believe in superstitions. Everyone who approached seemed to be burdened by the silence that had always pervaded that area. The earth beneath their feet, the rocks, and the trees all appeared to have witnessed something that no human should. The Appalachian morning mist always. In that part of Kentucky, it had its own personality. Like a living cloak, it descended from the heights, engulfing walkways and turning well-known trees into unidentifiable silhouettes. However, there was a noticeable difference in its behavior within the property. In other valleys, the mist had already been cleared by the sun, but there it seemed denser, more persistent, lingering. Over generations, mountain people acquired strange instincts. They discovered how to decipher natural cues that visitors might miss, recognize the warnings that the wind whispers among the pine trees, and the message that all these instincts were screaming was the same: that old wooden house on the hilltop should be avoided. It was more than small-town gossip or curiosity. Somewhere deep within their consciousness, it was a primal warning, something more visceral. Abigail started showing up in town at increasingly erratic times. At dawn, when the stores had just opened, she would occasionally show up. At other times, late at night, she would knock on the doors of shops, requesting to be served. Her face, which had always been pale, due to the remoteness of the mountains, now appeared to be translucent in the lantern's ambiguous light. As though sleep had abandoned her entirely, there were deep shadows in her eyes. She made an odd request when she went into the neighborhood pharmacy in 1921, during one of these late-night visits. She required a lot of certain herbs, some for medicinal purposes and others for less obvious uses. The middle-aged pharmacist, who knew almost everyone in the area, attempted to, starting a discussion. He inquired as to whether she needed any assistance and whether everything was all right on the property. Abigail gave him a startling look and answered with a single sentence that would reverberate in local discourse for weeks. There are obligations that must be fulfilled, and late payments are not accepted. Nobody understood what those words meant. What sort of debt might this be? Who is it with? There had never been any documented financial issues with the Kincaid family, and Abigail didn't have any close enough relationships with anyone to incur such obligations. There was a lot of speculation, with each theory getting more complex than the last. There were those who thought she had struck some sort of agreement with dubious tourists who occasionally traversed those mountains. Others discussed cursed inheritances, or ancestors' promises that were now being paid for. A strange odor started to emanate from the property. Although it wasn't strong enough to be detected from a distance, people who got close said it smelled sweet and sickening, like fruit that had been exposed to the sun for too long, combined with an ill-defined substance. Even in the absence of storms, the trees surrounding the house appeared ill, with branches breaking under their own weight and leaves wilting out of season. Some areas of the soil had an odd hue, dark patches that grew over time. A preacher on the road through the area made the decision to pay Abigail a visit. He believed it was his spiritual obligation to provide consolation and direction to even the most isolated members of the community. On a misty afternoon, he ascended the steep path to the property, firmly grasping his Bible beneath his arm. He waited after knocking on the dilapidated wooden door. The preacher instinctively flinched when Abigail opened it at last. He was stunned for extended periods of time by something in her expression, a blend of hopelessness and resolve. He wasn't invited in by her. The doorframe was the only thing separating them as they stood on the threshold. Abigail interrupted the preacher as he attempted to offer his prayers and discuss redemption and peace. According to her, decisions were made long before she was. Born roads paved with dirt and blood, and that some bonds could not be broken by kind words or well-meaning deeds. With a chilly mechanical politeness, she thanked him for coming, and then softly shut the door, leaving the man alone on that creaking porch. He descended the mountain more quickly than he had ascended. There was something very unsettling about that woman and that location, he told everyone who would listen. He was unable to identify it precisely, but he sensed that he was in the company of something out of the ordinary, something that went against the fundamental rules of how the world ought to function. His remarks, coming from a well-respected religious man in the area, added to the mounting fears. The mountains grew increasingly eerie at night. Strange noises, distorted echoes that seemed to come from impossible directions, drifted through the valleys. Some claimed to have heard voices speaking in unfamiliar tongues, and even though they couldn't understand what they were saying, the words made their skin crawl. Others mentioned playing melodies, on unidentified instruments, music that defied conventional patterns and made listeners feel queasy. Abigail became even more reclusive. She completely stopped going to town, and the merchants who had previously voiced their disapproval of her bizarre visits now questioned how she was managing. Her property did not receive any deliveries. The crops surrounding her home had completely withered, and no neighbors offered assistance. Those mountains were ruthless in the winter, and winter was coming. How? Did she plan on surviving the season without enough food? With its typical brutality, winter arrived in the mountains of Kentucky. The meandering paths were covered in snow, turning the surrounding area into a white wasteland where any movement could be seen for miles. Appalachian communities closed in on themselves during this time of year, with each family depending on its own resources to get by until spring. When the cold descended from the heights, these lands' natural isolation was intensified. The Kincaid property continued to be oddly active in those cold months. The fire was kept going day and night because smoke was continuously rising from the chimney. Apart from the fact that no one had witnessed Abigail gathering firewood in the previous weeks, this wouldn't be noteworthy in and of itself. From where did those unrelenting flames get their fuel? When the wind blew in the proper direction, the smoke's unusual color a greenish tint that blended with the typical gray-spread odor that reached the lower valleys. A fur, a hunter-trader who wandered the mountains, took the chance of paying a visit to the property. Curiosity about Abigail's condition motivated him just as much as business interest, and he had products that might be of interest to someone living alone. His steps sank to his ankles as he proceeded along the snow-covered path. The air seemed to get heavier as he approached the house, as though the atmosphere itself didn't want him there. He repeatedly knocked on the door without respond. The snow kept falling, muffling his voice as he called Abigail's name. He heard movement inside the house just as he was about to give up, footsteps dragging slowly toward the doorway. The door barely cracked open. She was imprisoned through the small opening by chains he had never seen before. He was able to catch a glimpse of the interior. He recoiled instinctively at what he saw. There was complete chaos in the house. The floor and walls were pressed up against the furniture, covered in odd markings that appeared to have been made with charcoal or a darker substance. There were candles lit all over the place, their feeble flickering light casting shadows that danced on the wooden walls, and there were items hanging from the ceiling that he couldn't quite make out at first glance, but that made his stomach knot. Abigail emerged from the crevice, her face so pale that it nearly melted into the snow. She said that he should go and never return because she didn't need anything. Her voice had a sense of urgency, almost like a warning. Without question, he obeyed. He stumbled in the snow as he hurried down the mountain, looking back every few paces as though he was being followed. When he eventually arrived at the populated area, he told everyone who would listen about his experience. His remarks fueled the rumors that were already going around. What on earth was going on in that remote house? What was it that Abigail was doing by herself? Stories about the Kincaid estate started to circulate away from prying eyes. Assumed dimensions that are almost legendary. People who had never been close to the location claimed to know certain details, information that spread by word of mouth and changed with each repetition. They talked about rituals carried out under the full moon, about guests who came in the middle of the night and departed before dawn, and about noises that caused the wolves in the nearby mountains to howl together. How much of these stories came from the collective imagination and how much was grounded in reality was indeterminate. Abigail received even more attention in 1922 after an odd incident. She went into the neighborhood church on one of her infrequent trips to the city. The congregation had already assembled for the service on this Sunday morning. The sermon was interrupted by her arrival, and everyone's attention was drawn to the slender, pale figure standing in the doorway. The crackling of the candles on the altar was the only sound to break the complete silence. Abigail's footsteps reverberated in the wooden room as she moved slowly down the aisle. She arrived at the front, gazed fixedly at the preacher, and then turned and walked away without saying anything. Nobody was able to decipher that gesture. Was it a provocation, a last goodbye before something irrevocable, or a silent cry for assistance? The preacher, who had been to her property months earlier, was clearly shaken. He attempted to continue the sermon, but his focus was totally lost, and his words came out rambling. Following the service, he assembled a few of the most esteemed members of the community and said that it might be time for someone to step in and see if Abigail was in danger or a threat. There was reluctance to accept the suggestion. It was against local customs to meddle in the life of someone who was so alone, especially when there was no obvious proof of any criminal activity. In the Appalachians, people placed a higher value on autonomy and privacy than nearly anything else. However, these customs were overthrown by the growing unease. They agreed to send a small team to the property just to see how things were going and to offer help if necessary. Despite the lack of enthusiastic volunteers, 3 men finally decided to travel. They decided to go on the expedition on a clear afternoon when the snow had stopped for the time being and the paths were barely usable. Finding strength in their numbers, they ascended the mountain together, their breaths forming vapor clouds in the frigid air. Their progress slowed as they approached the property. It wasn't only the physical tiredness from the ascent, but a more subdued resistance that made every step more difficult than the last. At last, they arrived at the wooden gate that signaled the start of the Kincaid property. Its rusty hinges groaned a sharp, unnerving sound as it swayed slightly in the breeze. The building in front of them appeared to be smaller and more curved than they had recalled, as though the ground were gradually engulfing it. Even though it was mid-afternoon, the windows were dark, and the smoke that had disappeared from the chimney where it had once risen steadily. There was complete silence in the area. Among the trees, no animals stirred and no birds sang. For a long while, the 3 men stood in front of the gate, waiting for one of them to move forward. During the ascent, the bravery they had mustered in the village appeared to have vanished, to be replaced by a growing sense of anxiety. There was something odd about the air surrounding the property. It was colder than it should have been, despite the elevation, and filled with a moisture that seeped through their bulky winter garments. At last, the group's eldest member crossed the gate first. His friends trailed behind, staying close to each other as though being physically apart would somehow shield them from the mounting anxiety. There were no recent footprints on the snow-covered path leading to the house, indicating that Abigail had not been out or visited for days. The trees around them appeared to be observing them, their naked. Branches stretched out against the gray sky like twisted fingers. They noticed details that were not apparent from a distance as they got closer to the veranda. The wood of the windows and door had been carved with symbols, crisscrossing lines and round marks that had no discernible pattern. Although they were rudimentary and appeared to have been constructed using makeshift tools, their arrangement was intentional. They encircled every opening in the house, as though they were meant to contain something, or stop something from getting inside. The older man gave the door a firm knock. In the oppressive quiet, 3 knocks reverberated more loudly than they ought to have. They held out. There was no response from within. Calling Abigail's name, he knocked once more, introduced himself, and clarified that they had only come to see how she was doing. They could still hear their own heartbeats thumping in their ears because the silence was so total. Maybe she was too sick or sleeping to respond, one of the men suggested. They gave the doorknob a try. It was unlocked and turned with ease when their hand applied pressure. With a long, sharp creak, the door's hinges protested as it slowly opened. Twilight filled the interior of the house with heavy cloths covering the windows to block out nearly all of the outside light. There was a strong smell coming from inside, the same sweet, cloying smell that had previously been mentioned but was now stronger due to the confinement. None of the 3 men were eager to enter, and they paused on the threshold. The house's main room was a scene of planned chaos. There were narrow pathways between the furniture because it was arranged in particular patterns. More of those symbols were drawn on the floor using a substance that left the wood permanently stained. With their wicks extinguished long ago to allow the wax to cool completely, melted candles created mountains of wax on every available surface. Objects wrapped in dark fabric and packages tied with strings that dripped a viscous substance hung from the ceiling, swaying slightly in the draft from the open door. Their voices sounded strange and muffled in that cramped room as they called for Abigail once more. They didn't know why they felt the need to avoid stepping on the marks on the floor, but they moved carefully through the room. There were only a few rooms in the house, and they quickly went through them all. They discovered blankets all over the place, half-empty glasses, and signs of recent visitors, but Abigail was nowhere to be seen. The most unsettling thing was discovered in the house's back room. Element. Words were written all over the walls, rising from the floor to the ceiling in erratic handwriting. Some had names none of them knew. Dates from decades before Abigail was born, and legible broken phrases about promises and debts. Others, letter combinations that didn't make words in any known language, were utterly unintelligible. A perfect circle had been drawn in the middle of the space, and Abigail's personal belongings were placed inside. The men, breathing the chilly mountain air as though they had been submerged, they left the house faster than they had come in. They all took a moment to process what they had seen before speaking. They finally came to the conclusion that they had to report what they had discovered, but they found it difficult to describe the atmosphere of that house and the sense that they had entered a place where unfathomable things had happened. They walked in thoughtful silence down the mountain. They were asked nervous questions by the town, but there. The responses were ambiguous and inadequate. How could they make sense of the unexplainable? As they stood there, how would they characterize the weighty sensation pressing against their chests? All they said was that Abigail wasn't in the house, that there were indications of extremely unsettling behavior inside, and that it might be best to leave the property alone. But new questions were raised by Abigail's absence. Where could she have gone if there were no footprints in the snow and she wasn't in the house? The mountain's inn. Anyone who went out unprepared in the winter would die. There was no way to get from that property to any populated area without going through places where people would undoubtedly see her. It seemed as though she had just vanished, leaving only that eerie scene and the questions that went along with it. Some proposed planning a more comprehensive search, looking all over the grounds, looking for natural shelters and caverns where she might have taken refuge. Others contended that Abigail would have made it easier for the authorities to find her if she had wanted to. Procedure. Her absence appeared purposeful, as if she had fully considered the repercussions of her decision. The community was divided over the debate. Some argued for active intervention, while others emphasized respect for individual liberty and privacy. The Kincaid property was covered in another layer of pure white as snow fell on the Kentucky mountains once more while they were debating. The house stood there, dark and silent, its mysteries hidden behind those walls adorned with unintelligible symbols. The nearby trees carried on with their. Abigail Kincaid had become a part of the mystery that had always encircled those ancient lands, with her eternal vigil, silent witnesses to events that defied any attempt at rational explanation, and somewhere in those vast and unforgiving mountains. There was an eerie quiet in that part of the Appalachians during the next few weeks. The Kincaid property remained unoccupied, its existence in the landscape akin to an unhealing wound. Even the most seasoned hunters changed their routes, and no one ventured near again. To stay away from those areas. Some places carry energies that defy reason, and this was undoubtedly one of them, according to an unspoken understanding. As is customary in the mountains, spring has just arrived, bringing with it the melting of snow and the awakening of the sleeping earth. Travelers crossed those passes once more with the Thor. The seasonal rhythm of life returned to the remote communities, and merchants resumed their regular routes. However, word of Abigail Kincaid's peculiar property had spread outside of the immediate boundaries that people who traveled between the villages carried. Fascinated by mountain stories, a scholar of local customs made the decision to conduct his own research. His academic interest was in the ways that remote communities created their own mythologies, and he was from a larger city in eastern Kentucky. He saw Abigail's story as the ideal illustration of how embellishment and repetition could turn ordinary facts into legends. In 1923, he came to the area with the intention of separating reality from fiction. His skepticism and methodical approach were immediately met with opposition. Some locals agreed to speak, possibly in the hopes that an outsider would provide insights that they were unable to obtain. But they did not like it when outsiders questioned their experiences, particularly when those questions were presented in an academic manner. Layers of complexity that the scholar had not expected were revealed by the conversations. Every individual who had dealt with Abigail gave a slightly different account of what happened. However, they all agreed on some basic issues. In the last few months, she had undergone a significant transformation, becoming profoundly disturbed instead of just reclusive. Everyone agreed that the house exuded an atmosphere that defied easy explanations, and her actions suggested that she was under tremendous pressure, responding to demands that only she could perceive. Confident that his reason would shield him from local superstitions, the scholar chose to go to the property by himself. On a sunny spring morning, he ascended the mountain with his notebook in hand, prepared to record his findings. New vegetation had grown along the trail, and the paths that humans had momentarily tamed were already being reclaimed by nature. In sharp contrast to the reports of complete quiet he had heard, birds were singing in the trees. When he got to the property, his confidence immediately faltered because there was something unquestionably oppressive about it. Even in the middle of the day, and with his mind trained to look for rational explanations, his lungs had to work harder to take in each breath because the air felt heavier. Take a breath. With the door ajar, the picture frames bearing symbols, and that sense of recent abandonment that makes a place seem more haunted than ancient ruins, the house was just as the previous visitors had described it. His initial arrogance gave way to a reluctant respect for his discomfort as he cautiously entered. Animals that had gained access through broken windows had partially disturbed the interior, but the spirit was still there. The writings on the room's walls, the symbols on the floor, and the items, all still there, waiting, suspended from the ceiling. He started taking notes, explaining every detail with scholarly accuracy, but his hands shook a little, revealing his lack of objectivity. She looked at the writings on the walls for hours, attempting to figure out their meanings or patterns. While some phrases seemed to be instructions for rituals, their meanings were unclear, while others were plainly depressing, lamenting impossible choices and unavoidable consequences. Additionally, there were numerous names, some of which were obviously. Some are entirely unknown, while others are members of the Kincaid family from earlier generations. It seemed as though Abigail was attempting to trace decades' worth of debt by mapping a genealogy of obligations. The scholar was startled to discover that he had lost all sense of time as the sun started to set. He had only planned to be on the property for a few hours, but he was so engrossed in his observations that nearly the whole day had passed. The interior of the house changed as the light faded. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw shadows stretching and warping the symbols on the floor, giving the impression that they were moving. The practical necessity of descending the mountain before total darkness did not fully drive his hasty departure. Something more was there, a primal instinct that cried out for him to get out of there despite all of his rational training. He glanced back one last time, already on the trail back. With its windows as dark as vacant eyes, the house appeared to be watching him, and for the first time in his academic career, he thought that some stories might not be superstitions or exaggerations, but rather poor attempts to convey realities that were beyond the realm of common language. The tone of his conversations changed when he returned to the village and spoke with the locals. His questions had lost their condescension and their shoddy disguise of skepticism. He had felt what they were attempting to explain, that indescribable presence that set the Kincaid property apart from any typical deserted location. A logical explanation would be that cultural expectations, isolation, and Abigail's unpredictable behavior all contributed to a collective psychological response. But he doubted that explanation, deep down, in parts of himself he seldom visited. A few days later, he left the area with notebooks full of notes and a restlessness that would follow him for years. He never turned that investigation into an academic article, as he had originally intended, and he never published his findings. When colleagues questioned him about his research in the Kentucky mountains, he would shift the topic and make evasive justifications about inadequate data or boring story points. The reality was both easier and harder to understand. He was at a loss for words to describe that experience in a way that his peers would understand without doubting his sanity. As a reminder of unsolved mysteries, the property continued to exist in silence, leaving its mark on the landscape. Seasons came and went, each affecting the deteriorating building. The wood rotted gradually. Parts of the roof started to droop. Windows lost their final pieces of glass, but the symbols were still there, defying the elements in a way that seemed to defy the laws of decay, and the stories about Abigail Kincaid kept coming back, each time adding new details that made them more than the facts themselves. Abigail Kincaid's story became something that went beyond personal recollection in the years that followed. It was now a component of. Travelers who traversed the desolate Appalachian trails whispered stories about those mountains on chilly nights around fireplaces. Every generation contributed their own theories and interpretations of what actually transpired on that remote hilltop property. Despite predictions of an impending collapse, the house remained intact. It ought to have given way to the weather long ago, with its walls collapsing in the ferocious winds and its decaying beams buckling under the weight of the winter snow. Lashed those heights, but in ways that engineers found difficult to understand, it continued to lean and deteriorate while remaining structurally intact. It seemed to be kept upright by something more than simple carpentry, a stubbornness that mirrored the very stubborn disposition of its previous occupant. A farming family contemplated purchasing the Kincaid lands in 1925. Technically, the property was available, but it was left unoccupied long enough for problems with legal ownership to surface. Despite its dubious reputation, the soil was fairly fertile, and access to natural water sources was provided by the location. Practically speaking, it made sense. However, the decision was made quickly and definitively when they visited the location with a local representative who handled land transactions. They wouldn't be persuaded to move there by any amount of money. The visit truly alarmed the representative, a practical man who had mediated dozens of similar negotiations over the years. Later, he recalled that when they got closer to the property, the horses wouldn't. They continued to nigh with unusual agitation, planting their hooves on the ground. They had to walk away after tying them up a fair distance away. When the family saw the house, their initial skepticism about the rumors completely changed. The children started crying for no apparent reason, and the family's matriarch firmly stated that she would never again enter that building. Similar opposition was encountered in later attempts to use the property. There wasn't interest, regardless of how low the price drops. For all intents and purposes, the land was cursed, a term that sensible people refrained from using in serious discourse but which encapsulated the general sentiment. Thus, the house stood unaltered, an inadvertent memorial to things no one could really comprehend. Occasionally, curious bystanders continued to travel there, captivated by the tales that continued to spread. Some came looking for cheap thrills, hoping to get scared so they could tell dramatic stories. Later, others pursued more serious pursuits, trying to comprehend phenomena that defied explanation, but they were all affected in some way and carried a disquiet that words could not fully express. The Kincaid house became the subject of an itinerant artist who painted landscapes while traveling through the mountains. For a few days, he set up camp close by, watching how the structure's light changed at different times and how the shadows acted strangely even at high sun. His first. Architectural details were accurately depicted in sketches. However, the more time he spent staring at the house, the more his depictions grew warped and took on unintended expressionistic characteristics. He worked feverishly, creating increasingly unsettling images on sheet after sheet. In subtle ways, the house appeared alive in his drawings. The leaning structure gave the impression of frozen movement, and the windows suggested eyes. A week later, he quickly packed up his belongings and departed, leaving several incomplete canvases. Months later, when a friend asked about the project, the artist merely shook his head and said that some places shouldn't be turned into works of art because doing so would bring something unwanted into the world. The seasons carried on with their never-ending cycle. The property was surrounded by wildflowers brought in by the spring, but they never got too close to the house. The mountains were teeming with life during the summers, but the immediate vicinity of the building remained oddly quiet, as though insects and animals had a silent pact to avoid each other. With the exception of the trees nearest to the house, which withered early and lost their leaves weeks before the others, autumns painted the forests with vivid hues, and winters blanketed everything with spotless snow that in some way seemed grayer in that specific area. As the decades passed, longtime locals who had either known Abigail directly or had at least seen her on occasion started to die. With the story's subtleties vanished, particulars that provided the event's context. Only versions that had been filtered through several retellings were known to younger generations, tales that had become more fantastical but had lost their grounding in reality. It had become pointless to debate what was real and what was embellishment. Fascinated by the story, a local history professor tried to create a definitive timeline of events. He conducted interviews with every survivor who interacted with Abigail, looked at legal documents, investigated property transaction files, and accessible records pertaining to the Kincaid family. His findings were contradictory and fragmentary, airy. The dates in the various accounts did not match. Depending on who was narrating the story, descriptions of the events varied greatly, and there were large gaps where trustworthy information was just unavailable. During his research, he made multiple visits to the property, each of which strengthened his belief that there was something truly unusual about that location. By nature, he was not superstitious. Although the house defied easy analysis, his academic training had taught him to look for empirical explanations for seemingly enigmatic phenomena. Regardless of visitors' beliefs or predispositions, it caused a genuine and quantifiable sense of unease. In the end, his project produced a small monograph that was less an attempt to unravel the mystery and more an exercise in documentation. According to the findings, Abigail Kincaid had. In the final months before her disappearance, her time and community acted in a highly unpredictable way. The property displayed signs of unusual activity, though it was unclear exactly what that activity was, and the psychological effects of the location on guests were too constant to be written off as mere conjecture, though the mechanisms underlying those effects were still unknown. The monograph generated some interest, but no significant revelations as it circulated among a small number of academic circles. It was just another document, cataloged but unresolved, added to the collection of mysteries that linger on the periphery of human experience. The professor carried on with his life, instructing generations of students in local history, while sporadically citing Abigail Kincaid's case as an illustration of how community narratives develop. The house, meanwhile, kept up its silent watch over the valleys below. Even though no one used it, it had become a landmark for directions that were casually mentioned in navigation instructions, for any useful reason. As permanent as the rocks and streams that characterized that area of the Kentucky mountains, it was now just a part of the landscape. It was impossible to separate its history from the place's identity without drastically altering people's perceptions of their own shared past. Occasionally, guests observed that photos of the property seldom looked good. Although there were no technical issues with the cameras, the resulting pictures had odd characteristics, such as being blurry even when. Other images taken that same day either showed areas of inexplicable darkness that didn't match the actual lighting conditions or came out perfectly sharp. Some ascribed this to the quirks of the era's photographic apparatus. Others perceived these recurring defects as having a deeper significance. In contrast to the rest of the world, time moves differently in the Kentucky mountains. Even after decades, some locations can essentially stay the same due to a lack of motivation to change, rather than deliberate effort. Them. One of those places that was isolated from the advancements that were progressively changing other parts of the region was the Kincaid State. That house on the hilltop continued to deteriorate slowly, unaffected by the modernization marches, even as roads were being paved and electricity was being brought to the valleys. A strange phenomenon started to be noticed in 1928. On some nights, lights emerged from the house's windows. For miles, faint flickering lights could be seen through the mountain's darkness. They differed from the lights of common candles or lanterns. Their intensity varied erratically, and they had a distinct, almost phosphorescent quality. These sightings were reported by hunters who were camping nearby, always with the same puzzling query. In a house that everyone knew was empty, who or what was creating that illumination? Some speculated that they were either chemical reactions of decomposing materials or simply moon reflections on shattered glass. Others cited natural occurrences like fireflies gathering in odd patterns or gases emitted from the earth that, in certain circumstances, might produce luminescence. However, these explanations did not fully account for the light's appearance on moonless nights, or their apparent purposeful movement from window to window. During one of these incidents, a group of young people made the decision to look into it. They belonged to a generation that challenged the superstitions of their elders, but they were the offspring of local farmers who had grown up hearing tales about Abigail Kincaid. Outfitted. One night, when the lights had been sighted, they ascended the mountain with flashlights and a youthful confidence that concealed true anxiety. Although they were not entirely convinced, their families did not support the expedition. Around midnight, they reached the property with only the stars and their flickering lanterns to light their way. The black silhouette of the house, darker than the surrounding darkness, stood out against the night sky. From their starting position, no lights were visible, which made. They questioned if the reports were overblown. However, as they got closer, one of the second-story windows started to emit a pale glow that grew steadily, as though it was being fed by an unseen source. The young men looked at each other, their initial arrogance quickly fading. The glow pulsated in a rhythm that was almost natural, like deep, slow breathing, and had a hypnotic quality. One of them proposed that they go back because they had seen enough to pique their interest. The others promptly concurred, and none were embarrassed to admit their uneasiness. They hurried down the mountain more quickly than they had ascended it, looking back now and then to see if the light was still there. Like a candle blown by an unexpected gust of wind, it stayed lit until they were too far away to tell it apart, and then suddenly went out. The mystery surrounding the property was further compounded by the rapid circulation of their stories about that night. The elderly nodded contentedly, believing their cautions had been validated, while other members of the same generation has. Reluctantly, the youth started to show respect for the location. Even in the modern era that was starting to reach those far-off mountains, there might have been something more than fantastical tales, something that warranted caution. The environment around the house kept acting in ways that weren't consistent with its usual patterns. As though trying to get as far away from the building as possible, trees grew crookedly and leaned away from it. Circular patterns appear when roots that ought to naturally seek water avoid particular parts of the soil. A vegetation that created voids around particular locations. Examining the land, amateur geologists acknowledged that there was something peculiar about the way the plants responded to their surroundings, but they did not find anything clearly abnormal in the composition of the soil. Reports of these unusual plant traits piqued the interest of a visiting botanist, who studied the local flora for weeks. He tried to grow seeds from the region under controlled circumstances, gathered samples, and examined growth patterns. His outcomes were uncertain but unsettling. On the surface, the plants seemed healthy, but he was unable to explain the subtle cellular abnormalities. The seeds germinated normally when he attempted to cultivate them far from the area, as though the distance from the property released them from some local influence. He wrote cautiously about his findings, speculating that plant development might be impacted by microclimatic quirks or contaminants in the soil. However, in private discussions, he acknowledged real bewilderment, stating that he had never seen such patterns in his decades of botanical research. In his experience, the laws of nature were predictable. The laws of that area of the Kentucky mountains appeared to be a little different. Many parts of the United States experienced economic hardship during the 1930s, and Appalachian communities were no different. There was less mental room for mysteries and conjecture about haunted houses because people had to deal with immediate practical challenges to survival. During this time, the Kincaid estate was mentioned sporadically but was not as much of a focus as it had been in the past. However, oblivion did not imply that the house was no longer there or that its significance in the landscape had decreased. In ways that engineers found remarkable, it remained there, slowly crumbling, but avoiding total collapse. Some structural integrity was preserved in wood that should have completely rotted, roofs that ought to have collapsed due to decades of. A portion of the accumulated snow was still present. The house appeared to have achieved a delicate balance with the natural forces, neither fully thriving nor fully collapsing. Every now and then, someone would propose tearing down the building so that the land could heal naturally and that the structure would no longer be a blemish on the landscape. But these suggestions never went beyond casual discussion. A portion of the opposition was pragmatic. The expense and work involved in demolishing such a far-off building hardly justified the advantage. However, there was also a more profound reluctance, an implicit fear that altering the house would bring up things that were better left alone. Using the story of Abigail Kincaid as a parable about the perils of deviating from the correct path, a preacher who visited different congregations in the mountains started incorporating it into his sermons. In his retellings, Abigail came to represent a person who had made poor decisions, yielded to negative influences, and ultimately paid a price for her obstinacy. It was an obvious message: remain in the light, avoid temptation, have faith and community to lead you. The story surrounding the property gained a new dimension as a result of these religious interpretations. By placing the story within a well-known moral framework, it became easier for some people to understand. Others believed it to be an oversimplification of something more nuanced and unclear. But regardless of the precise interpretation, the result was to preserve the tale, guaranteeing that future generations were exposed to at least one version of the tale of Abigail Kincaid and the enigmatic home that stood as a silent reminder of things no one could quite make sense of. The Kentucky mountains underwent slow changes over the ensuing decades. However, the Kincaid property continued to be a temporal anchor that was tied to a specific moment and would not entirely vanish into the past. It was hard to picture those mountains without the house's solemn presence ruling the highlands. It had become so ingrained in the local mythology. Narratives concerning Abigail were told with the timeless quality of genuinely ancient legends, as though the events had happened centuries ago rather than just a few decades ago. A particularly strong storm battered the area for several days in 1935. Trees were uprooted by violent winds. Thunder reverberated through the valleys like celestial artillery, and torrential rains triggered landslides. Everyone anticipated that the Kincaid home would ultimately fall victim to this natural attack, that one night of elemental rage would finish decades of deterioration. However, when the house was still standing when the residents went outside to evaluate the damage. Nearby trees had fallen, some nearly to the walls, but the building itself was still largely intact. The main walls were still intact, but a portion of the roof had flown off and some windows had lost their frames. The building appeared to have been purposefully spared by the storm, or it might have run into obstacles it was unable to overcome. People were both surprised and uneasy as they watched this. Additional proof that this establishment was operational, based on its own regulations. Abigail Kincaid's story captivated a writer who was traveling through the area gathering local tales for a book on Appalachian folklore. In contrast to the scholarly researcher of earlier times, this author was more interested in the ways that communities create and maintain their mythologies than in verifiable facts. For him, the significance that people attached to the story was more important than the event's actual veracity. He stayed in the area for months, speaking with locals about all ages, gathering various iterations of the story. Every individual had a distinct perspective, particulars that others omitted, and interpretations that mirrored their personal experiences and convictions. The psychological effects of isolation were highlighted by an elderly farmer. A nearby midwife concentrated on potential unspoken family tragedies that might account for Abigail's actions. A retired businessman recalled certain exchanges that revealed potential financial issues. The author made multiple visits to the property. Times, always with the help of local guides who wouldn't let him travel alone. They waited politely while he inspected the building, making notes and attempting to put into words the mood that everyone spoke of but few could fully express. He acknowledged experiencing a presence that was neither overtly menacing nor welcoming, akin to being in an environment where his presence was accepted but not welcomed. When his book was eventually released, a whole chapter was dedicated to Abigail Kincaid's story. He used the story to illustrate how remote communities deal with upsetting occurrences and turn them into narratives that have social and psychological significance. The house had come to stand for anxieties about loneliness, the fallout from bad decisions, and mysteries that defy easy explanation. In his view, it was more significant as a narrative than as a collection of historical facts that could be independently verified. With modest circulation, the book found readers among folklore and cultural anthropology enthusiasts. The area received some external attention as a result of the sporadic pilgrimages made by interested bystanders to view the well-known home they had read about. Residents of the area felt conflicted about this attention. While they appreciated that their history was being studied, they felt uneasy about outsiders treating something they cared about deeply as merely a matter of intellectual interest. A particular kind of visitor started to frequent the house over time. Those who are curious about paranormal activity, individuals who follow alternative spiritual traditions, and are looking for experiences that go beyond the ordinary. They carried a variety of gear, including sensitive recorders, special cameras, and instruments that were purported to measure invisible energies. They stayed on or close to the property at night, performing rituals or just watching while they waited for manifestations. These guests described a range of experiences. Some departed disappointed, claiming to have found nothing more than an old, dilapidated home. Others reported having meaningful experiences. Voices whispering in unidentified languages, visions of figures that vanished when directly observed, and feelings of presence. These claims could not be verified, and it was impossible to distinguish between real experiences and expectation-driven imagination. However, the consistency of some reports, particularly those describing chest heaviness and breathing difficulties close to the house, raised the possibility that there was more going on here than just psychological suggestion. The neighborhood took a practical approach to these guests. As long as they respected nearby private property and didn't cause trouble, they weren't discouraged or stopped. They acknowledged that they no longer had control over how Abigail Kincaid's story was interpreted and used, and that it now belonged to a wider realm. There was a certain unease about this, a sense that something important and intimate had been overshadowed by outside attention. There was a plan in 1940 to convert the land into a museum or official historical site. Supporters contended that maintaining the location would enable teaching about local history and might have some positive economic effects from tourism. Critics argued that it was disrespectful to commercialize tragedy, even one that was enshrouded in mystery and occurred decades apart. Furthermore, when the fundamental facts were still so disputed and unclear, there were practical concerns about how to museumalize something. Eventually, the proposal was dropped not by a formal ruling, but just, since it lost speed. Nobody was dedicated enough to see the project through community opposition and real-world challenges. The house went back to being partially forgotten, visited now and then, but never included in any official or commercial story. The seasons carried on with their never-ending cycle. On that property, spring's promises of renewal were never fully fulfilled. The summer heat felt more oppressive there than it did elsewhere. Autumns painted the mountains with a melancholy beauty that grew more intense when that crumbling building was around. And when the snow fell on that partially collapsed roof in the winter, it somehow never seemed to be entirely white. There were fewer and fewer longtime residents who had either known Abigail in person or had at least seen her from a distance. With their passing, there was no longer any direct link to the original events, turning verifiable history into a legend that was passed down through the generations. Younger generations knew only versions that had been filtered through numerous retellings. These were tales that had lost the subtleties that could be obtained from first-hand witnesses, but had gained fantastical elements. The house itself was unchanged, a silent guardian of secrets that no one could now directly divulge. The Kentucky mountains underwent significant transformation in the decades that followed, changes that permeated even the most isolated communities and remote valleys. Improved roads, more dependable communications, and access to the outside world, which had previously appeared far away, started to have a greater impact on conventional lifestyles. The Kincaid estate, however, continued to be a peculiar anomaly, a location that appeared to exist outside the typical course of time and development, even as modernity encroached on those ancient lands. Decades ago, the house should have collapsed due to its state of ruin. The structure's persistence baffled engineers who occasionally looked at it out of professional curiosity. There was serious damage to the main beams. The exterior walls displayed cracks that should have caused the structure to collapse, and the foundation had moved in multiple locations. However, even as details gradually crumbled, the building's basic form remained recognizable. This slow deterioration had an almost intentional quality, as though the house were actively fighting a total return to the ground. Over the years, locals who had seen it noted that some areas appeared to deteriorate more quickly than others, but always in such, so that the structure as a whole remained intact. Whole windows vanished, leaving voids that stared like eye sockets out into the valleys. Eventually, some of the roof collapsed, revealing beams to the sky, but the walls, those walls with the unsettling writings and symbols, were still intact. In 1948, a group of returning veterans made the decision to camp in the mountains for a few days in order to find solitude and quiet time to reflect on events that had profoundly impacted them. They selected a comparatively close to the Kincaid property, not because of any particular historical significance, but just because it was a nice place to camp. The locals attempted to gently discourage them by offering alternative sites, but the veterans dismissed these warnings as rural superstition, which they had learned to disregard from their time spent in the wider world. On the hilltop, they pitched camp in a clearing with a partial view of the house. On the first day, everything appeared to be as usual. They hiked along the trails, went fishing in neighboring streams, and discussed their plans for the future now that they were back in civilian life around the campfire. However, the atmosphere changed slightly as night fell. The forest around them grew too silent. Due to the unsettling acoustic void created by the absence of typical nighttime sounds, one of them was unable to fall asleep and continued to gaze at the stars and the house from time to time. Even though he was aware that no one lived there, he vowed to have seen silhouettes moving from room to room through the dark windows. At first, he wrote them off as. The movements persisted, always at the periphery of his vision, and vanished when he attempted to focus directly. They were tricks of light and shadow, projections of his own weary mind. Pointing toward the house, he roused his companions. For many minutes, they all watched in silence. Some claimed to have only seen a dilapidated building against the night sky, and nothing out of the ordinary. Others acknowledged that they saw something, but they were unable to describe it precisely. There was a feeling of being there. Direction, a sense of being observed by a carefully concealed entity. One of them, who had seen fierce fighting and had developed an acute sense of danger, merely advised them to depart right away. With the help of flashlights and a military-trained efficiency, they set up camp even in the dark. They all understood through nonverbal communication that staying there would be a grave mistake, even though none of them expressed fear out loud. That same evening, they made their way down the mountain. Utilizing paths that were only lit by their flashlights and the sporadic moonlight that broke through the clouds. When they arrived in civilization, they reluctantly described what had happened to them, embarrassed that something so indescribable had driven them away. Their accounts gave the property's stories legitimacy. These were men who had dealt with actual lethal threats and were not easily alarmed by ghosts or folklore. Maybe there was some truth to the warnings if they felt compelled to leave that location quickly. It had been handed down through generations. When the local community heard their stories, they nodded silently in recognition, without passing judgment, but with the knowledge that they had at last understood something that could only be felt, not explained. The 1950s saw a resurgence of interest in all types of unexplained phenomena. Articles about unsolved mysteries were published in popular magazines. Strange stories were explored on radio shows. Additionally, there was a growing cultural demand for stories that were inexplicable. The narrative of. In this context, Abigail Kincaid and her peculiar property found a readership by being featured in publications that extended well beyond Kentucky's boundaries. This attracted a fresh group of tourists, some of whom were serious about their research, while others were just looking for excitement or material for their own narratives. An unofficial protocol was established by the local community to handle these inquisitive people. They provided basic instructions, but included strict guidelines, and they politely responded to inquiries without promoting inquiry, warnings, and consistently stressed the importance of honoring the memory and property of those who were involved in the initial events, no matter how obscure they were. In 1952, an independent documentary filmmaker came to the area with cameras and a resolve to document the Kincaid property's ambience. He approached the topic with professional skepticism, but an open mind, while working on projects about other supposedly haunted locations. He filmed the house for weeks at different times and from different perspectives, of day and different types of weather. He spoke with locals, gathered testimonies, and tried to piece together a cohesive story from disparate pieces. The outcome was odd. There were many unexplained technical flaws in the movie, particularly in the house shots. Where they shouldn't have, dark streaks emerged. For no apparent reason, the focus failed, and audio recordings that should have been clean were tainted by odd noises. He put a lot of effort into figuring out what was wrong with his equipment. However, in other settings, the same instruments performed flawlessly. Attempts to capture the essence of the property on celluloid were met with resistance, as if the property actively opposed being documented. The documentary was never finished to a high standard. Parts remain in obscure archives, occasionally viewed by fans of oddities in film. However, the director was never able to bring the pieces together in a way that made sense for mass release. In subsequent interviews, he acknowledged that the project had been his. The subject's refusal to cooperate with traditional documentation was the biggest professional failure, not due to a lack of effort. The house, meanwhile, carried on with its lifeless existence. Every winter raised hopes that it would be the last, that ice and snow would finally accomplish what decades of weather had failed to do. The structure continued, weakened but not destroyed, as each spring demonstrated. Its refusal to entirely vanish had become almost defiant, as though Abigail Kincaid had left behind naught. Only a physical structure, but the stone and wood were infused with a certain stubbornness. Youngsters in the area were raised on tales about the property, versions that were modified for younger audiences to omit the more unsettling details while preserving the sense of mystery. For them, it was both an actual physical feature and a part of the local imaginative geography. Challenges to see who could approach the house the closest were part of the games. parental disapproval of bold games that persisted generation after generation. Generation. In fact, few came very close. Instinctual discomfort, which typically triumphed over childish bluster before perilous distances were reached. Permission to conduct experiments on the property was requested by a visiting psychologist who was interested in the effects of physical environments on mental states. In order to determine whether there were quantifiable elements to the frequently reported discomfort, he aimed to gauge people's physiological reactions as they approached the house. To the extent that they were in place, local authorities. Property refused permission due to practical concerns about liability in the event that research participants suffered harm, not because of a scientific objection. Nevertheless, he carried out a small number of studies with volunteers who consented to approach the property while wearing portable monitoring devices. The findings were intriguing but not definitive. As they got closer to the house, many participants experienced increases in blood pressure and heart rate that were not entirely explained by the physical. The effort required to climb the hill. Although some people reported experiencing nausea or vertigo that went away when they moved away, it was difficult to pinpoint the precise cause of these reactions. According to the psychologist's findings, which were published in a small academic journal, some places may have developed psychic imprints that had subtle but quantifiable effects on tourists. Colleagues who thought his theories were too speculative for serious science viewed them with skepticism. However, he insisted that there was a genuine phenomenon that, despite the unsolved mechanisms, merited more research. Like leaves blown by the Appalachian wind, the years went by, each season making a slight alteration to the terrain, but never erasing the past. The boundaries between the explainable and the mysterious appeared to be thinner here than in other parts of the world, and the Kincaid estate continued to be a silent witness to something that went beyond easy comprehension. The house kept slowly crumbling, the wood, slowly making its way back to the earth, but even in its advanced ruin, it remained unmistakably present. When passing over those mountains, travelers continued to veer off course whenever they could, still experiencing a constriction in their chest when they saw the dilapidated building at the top of the hill. It wasn't a fear of anything in particular, but rather an innate understanding that some places have a significance that words can't fully express. Over the years, Abigail Kincaid's stories have changed, gaining layers of interpretation that represented the worries and fantasies of every generation that recounted them. For some, it was a story about the psychological effects of loneliness. Others saw it as a reminder that not everything can be explained by reason and logic, and as a mystery that defies easy answers. And to many, it was just a tale that was as fundamental to those mountains' character as the pines and the frozen streams. What actually transpired on that land in the last few months prior to Abigail's disappearance? What forces? Whether it was natural or not, how could a lone woman in a typical house become a legend that would last for generations? Like whispers of secrets that no one wants to fully reveal, these questions lingered in the mists that descend from the heights without clear answers. The region's present inhabitants have a complicated relationship with its past. There is pride in having such a compelling story, but there is also unease about the attention it occasionally attracts. Occasionally, tourists still go on pilgrimages in an attempt to connect with something beyond the norm and feel the presence that so many people have talked about over the years. Decades of inquisitive tourists have taught the community to tolerate them with patience, providing basic hospitality while keeping a respectful distance from conjecture about deeper meanings. In its ongoing existence, the property itself has become nearly abstract. It is now more than just a physical building. It is a marker in the landscape, a symbol, symbolizing everything in the human experience that cannot be explained. No one has ever been able to fully decipher the symbols hidden within the moss and vine-covered walls that remain intact. Silences that seem deeper than the simple lack of sound reverberate through the empty rooms. Sometimes the wind brings something more when it blows through the valleys on winter nights, bringing with it the smell of frozen earth and pine. Those who listen can hear the whispers of past events and echoes of old tales that mark those places in ways that time has not been capable of erasing entirely. They are impressions, feelings that make the skin crawl and the heart race for no apparent reason, rather than actual voices. The Kincaid house is an unintentional monument to the mysteries that intersperse human existence in the Kentucky mountains. It stands for every question we pose without anticipating a response. All of those times when we feel as though there is more to reality than meets the eye. It serves as a reminder that there are still dark places in the world where certainty vanishes, and the mysterious is in charge. We tell these stories because we understand the significance of the questions, not necessarily because we know the answers. They link us to earlier generations who gazed at the same locations and experienced the same chills of recognition when confronted with the unknown. And even if the main mystery is left unsolved, maybe in that connection we will discover something worthwhile. With typical jealousy, the mountains guard their secrets. As long as there is, the Kincaid estate will remain. Sufficient wood to keep the form recognizable. And even after that, its existence will live on in the collective consciousness of the people who inhabit those regions. No matter where she went on that final winter night, so many decades ago, Abigail Kincaid left behind something that goes beyond her own physical presence. And maybe that's why tales like this have such a strong impact. They serve as a reminder of how vulnerable we are to unknown forces. Our search for purpose even in the absence of obvious facts. Just as Abigail Kincaid's story is still being told, the house continues to slowly deteriorate but resist total oblivion. Every narration adds a few minor variations while keeping the mystery at its core. If you liked this trip through the Kentucky mountain shadows, you might want to subscribe to the channel. Numerous other eerie tales are just waiting to be discovered. Mysteries that should be revealed but are concealed in obscure places. Post a comment with your thoughts on Abigail's mystery. Kincaid. Remember to like if this story resonated with you. Silently guarding secrets that might never be fully uncovered, the mountains wait. And somewhere in those mist-covered heights, a house keeps its lonesome watch, a permanent record of things that are beyond easy explanation and, as they ought to be, cloaked in mystery.